Well done, you've almost made it. You've heard about pulmonary hypertension and its epidemiology in Chapter 1, got familiar with assessing it in Chapter 2, and finally learned about different pathologies affecting the right heart in Chapter 3. So what we want to do now is just give you a brief overview about different causes leading either to right ventricular pressure overload, volume overload, or both. So have a look at it. Not infrequently, we've got a patient in Yacolab where we don't know the diagnosis and find a dilated right ventricle. And here is such a patient. The right ventricle is clearly dilated. The interventricular septum is flattened, predominantly in diastole. But first of all, you have to make sure that the right ventricle is dilated. So you have to optimize your image and try to image from as far apical as possible. And once you have done that, you can just by eyeballing see whether the right ventricle is bigger than the left one.
But we can also quantify the size of the right ventricle by simply measuring it in a 4-chamber view. We talked about that and also about the pitfalls in the chapter on how to image.
Once you're sure that the right ventricle is dilated, look at the interventricular septum. And if that's flattened during diastole, look for causes of right ventricular volume overload. And those causes would be tricuspid regurgitation, as you can see here, or pulmonic insufficiency, an atrial septum defect, or an anomalous drainage of the pulmonic vein.
In contrast, if we have flattening of the interventricular septum, which is present predominantly during systole, then this speaks in favor of pressure overload. And pressure overload can occur in all forms of pulmonic hypertension, pre- and post-capillary, in pulmonic stenosis, and in pulmonary embolism, which is also a form of pulmonary hypertension.
In many patients you will find a systolic and diastolic flattening of the interventricular septum. This means pressure and volume overload, and it's quite difficult to identify which is the predominant problem.
Flattening of the interventricular septum can be a very important sign because it can be the only sign of pulmonic hypertension, especially if you cannot record a tricuspid regurgitation signal. However, be aware that the degree of pulmonic hypertension does not necessarily correlate with the degree of flattening. Why? Because in reality it depends on the pressure difference between the right and the left ventricle. And you will have patients who have fairly high left ventricular pressure. For example, they have hypertension. In this case, the flattening will not be very prominent. In contrast, if the pressure in the left ventricle is very low, as you will find it in patients with pulmonic hypertension, which are basically end stage, patients who have multiple treatments or multiple medications, which also cause the left ventricular pressure to drop, they will have a very prominent flattening of the interventricular septum.
So there's a lot of information you can get out of looking at the interventricular septum.
But don't forget, there's also other reasons for abnormal septal motion aside from pressure or volume overload. For example, postoperatively or patients who have conduction abnormalities. But this is an issue we'll be discussing in future chapters.